The music industry, and more specifically the EDM industry, is in a constant state of change. These changes become more obvious as years pass and we look back on what once was. I attended my first electronic music concert in March of 2015, and the scene looks pretty dramatically different 10 years later. In this video, we'll take a trip back in time to see what was going on in the EDM scene a decade ago. At the beginning of the year, Rez was relatively unknown, but that all changed in the summer of 2015 when she dropped her Insurrection EP on Nest HQ. It received a lot of praise coming from blogs, giving her a spotlight as a promising young producer to watch in the coming years, and now 10 years later, it's very obvious that all the hype was well-deserved. And while we're speaking of young talent, Oliver Heldens had quickly become one of the hottest DJs in the world with his breakout track from the previous year, Gecko. This led to an unlikely collab with Zed's Dead for a future house track released on Spinnin' Records called You Know. Ganja White Knight was beginning to claw their way out of obscurity and into the spotlight with the success of their Mr. Wobble album. They had already been around for 13 years by this point, and they were actually about ready to give up. But the Mr. Wobble album gave them the commercial success that they wanted for so long, and just look at where they're at now. The Marshmello project made its debut, and the hype around the mysterious DJ spread like wildfire. Though his identity was uncovered just a few months after the project's launch, revealing him to be Chris Comstock, also known as thetrapdj.com. 2015 was a hybrid year for Marshmello, as he still had obligations as .com, so he was performing under both aliases that year. And speaking of masked DJs, Marshmello wasn't the only DJ to wear a mask that popped up that year. Malo launched their project in the fall of 2015 with their debut single, Pregnant. There was a lot of mystery surrounding Mala's identity in the coming years, with many speculating that the project was the brainchild of childhood friends Tchami, Mercer, and DJ Snake. But it was later revealed that Sebastian Bennett is the man behind the mask. Hero Bust was quickly making a name for himself, with many of his unreleased tracks from his 2016 I'm Allowed album being rinsed by nearly every trap DJ. Galantis released their debut album Pharmacy, featuring EDM classics like Runaway You and I and Gold Dust. 2015 was basically the tail end of the peak SoundCloud era, with some massive hits dropped that year like Weethan's XE3 and Illusion by Coyote Kisses. However, 2015 was also the beginning of SoundCloud's downfall. They rolled out their plans to monetize the platform, and a copyright crackdown ensued, effectively killing off the bootleg remixes that had made SoundCloud so popular. Avicii released his Stories album that year, Cascade released his Automatic album, which has the massive track Disarm You, and Grizz released his debut album, Say It Loud. Grizz's sound was much different than it is today, as it was more of a funk glitch hop fusion, whereas his more recent tracks before his hiatus were mostly dubstep. Alan Walker released his breakout track Faded, and Kygo was quickly making a name for himself as his track Firestone was wildly popular. Space Laces was basically a local DJ in Louisville, but he was producing tracks at an incredibly high level and getting support from major artists, making him what I consider to be the most brutally underrated artist of 2015. Tchami was in his breakout era pioneering the Future House genre. He would use the hashtag Future House on all his SoundCloud releases, and the term was adopted on a widespread scale, giving birth to the new genre of house music. He released the Afterlife EP that year, and I personally consider Afterlife to be one of his best tracks of all time. An EDM movie called We Are Your Friends came out in theaters, and it brutally tanked at the box office. It featured Zac Efron as an aspiring producer and DJ, and the whole movie is terribly corny, which was kind of to be expected, but the soundtrack is pretty decent, so at least there's that. Tomorrow World had its final year-end in disaster after a rainstorm turned the festival grounds into a giant pit of mud. This was only the third year of the festival, and the parent company SFX Entertainment collapsed the next year. But while some festivals became failures, others emerged as promising newcomers. Crostfest made their debut in 2015, offering a boutique lineup of house and techno, and since then they have gone on to be a huge success. Insomniac also launched the first ever all-trance festival in North America, Dream State, which has also seen tremendous success since their debut. Claude Von Stroke, also known as Barclay Crenshaw, debuted the first ever Dirty Bird Campout, giving fans of the Off-Kilter house music label an immersive experience like no other.
Yo, it's Claude. We had an incredible time. I played every single activity. Can't wait for next year. This is fucking awesome.
2015 was also the year that Dimitri Vegas and Like Mike were exposed for buying votes to land the #1 spot on the DJ Mag Top 100, exposing the illegitimacy of the list, which hasn't really been taken seriously ever since. Jamie XX released his debut solo album In Color, which had widespread appeal and became one of the biggest electronic albums of the year. Zedd also released his album True Colors, with tracks like I Want You to Know and Beautiful Now dominating the radio airwaves. Dylan Francis was in the midst of his Snapchat comedian era, positioning himself as one of the most entertaining DJs with his silly antics, but simultaneously dropping heaters to back it up. 2015 saw the release of his This Mixtape is Fire EP, featuring collabs with Skrillex, Kygo, and Calvin Harris. Disney dropped their lawsuit against Deadmau5 regarding a trademark dispute, as they had alleged that Deadmau5's helmet was too similar to Mickey Mouse. Disney quickly dropped the case after Deadmau5's legal team called them out on illegally using his song Ghosts and Stuff in a Mickey Mouse animation video uploaded to the internet by Disney Interactive. Major Lazer and DJ Snake dropped the track Lean On, which got a ton of radio play and now has nearly 4 billion streams on YouTube. Jack U also made their debut with their one and only album, Skrillex and Diplo present Jack U. The Joyride project made its debut with self-released tracks like Kickin' Off, Mercy, and Flow. These tracks made waves, allowing Joyride to have his very first gig at EDC Las Vegas the following year, something that had never happened before. Getter's notoriety was quickly rising as his 2015 Allegiance EP started to gain traction, spearheaded by the track Head Splitter. Jai Wolf was also making a name for himself after his debut foreign family release Indian Summer gained widespread appeal. Louis the Child also catapulted into the mainstream after their first official single, It's Strange, blew up. Illenium was also beginning to make a name for himself after some major singles like Spirals and I'll Be Your Reason. Nightmare had his breakout year in 2015, which started with him releasing the track Street, which was then played out by Skrillex at Ultra, which led to Nightmare being the opening act for EDC Las Vegas that same year. The EDM Trap era was in full bloom, with Flosstradamus releasing the Soundclash EP, plus Prison Riot with GTA and Lil Jon, which has one of the most memorable pre-drop vocals of that era. Loudpack was still together in 2015, but they would split up 2 years later, as Kenny Beats would go on to establish a solo career as a hip-hop producer. Party Favor was blowing up, and his track Bap You was used in a T-Mobile commercial, giving him nationwide exposure.
At T-Mobile, we're changing everything you know about wireless.
Gladiator were pumping out some of the hottest trap remixes on SoundCloud, but they split up not much later, and one of them is now a podcast producer. RL Grime was taking his career to a new level after the success of his Void EP, which was released in late 2014. Martin Garrix sued Spinnin' Records and his former management, saying that he was taken advantage of and given false and misleading information regarding the rights of his masters. The case was settled, and ownership of the masters were transferred to him right before his 18th birthday. And speaking of young producers in Spinnin' Records, a 17-year-old Kirby was blowing up after releasing tracks like Discharge and Rubber on Spinnin'. Cruella was in the middle of their first year without a producer since they kicked Rain Man out of the group in late 2014. The Chainsmokers were mostly known for their SoundCloud remixes, but they dropped Roses in 2015, which was their first big hit, though they wouldn't make it big until the following year when they released Closer. Porter Robinson found a new level of success in the midst of his Worlds Tour, which is now a distant memory for fans who have seen his project undergo many transformations. His good friend Madeon also released his debut album Adventure that same year. In 2015, Flume's popularity was at an all-time high, but he would go on to reach even greater heights in 2016 with the release of his Skin album. Bassnectar was basically in the peak of his career, and he was more or less one of the biggest bass artists in the world with a cult following. A very stark contrast to how he is viewed today after his downfall began in 2020. Artists like Datsik and Space Jesus also held a strong level of notoriety, which they no longer hold for the same reasons as Bassnectar. Grimes was a somewhat obscure indie artist with a passionate and dedicated fanbase, and she was quickly becoming a well-respected producer. However, she became known in the mainstream when she started dating Elon Musk 3 years later, which largely overshadowed everything that she had accomplished before that point. Brills was in the midst of one of the most challenging times in his life as he was struggling with substance abuse while simultaneously losing his passion for the Brills project. He would eventually abandon the alias a couple years later, and through a journey of self-discovery, he emerged with the LS Dream project, which was a stark contrast to the Brills sound. Eric Prydz released the title track from his upcoming 2016 album Opus, which is considered to be one of his best tracks of all time, with some considering Opus to represent Eric Prydz in the same way that Strobe represents Deadmau5. Flying Lotus was in the midst of his Hypercube tour, which in my opinion is one of the best stage designs ever done within electronic music. Odesza was quickly becoming one of the hottest acts of the year, selling out their entire In Return tour, though the success that they saw in 2015 was just a small taste of what was to come.